This series of stories is intended to make you laugh, cry, and reflect on your own life. Enjoy a wonderful man, my dad, sharing stories from his life between the years of 1944 to the present.
The Chattahoochee River is a river course that begins far back in the Blue Ridge Mountains with spring-fed runoffs that wind their way, ever increasing in volume and flow as they tumble and pour through the crevices, rocks, valleys, and down hills of the mountains and eventually through the river itself. The surrounding hills and higher places don't really hinder or delay the water's flow, merely redirect the course and send it cascading in different paths and streams that all eventually make up the river itself. The Chattahoochee isn't the longest, widest, or mightiest of rivers, but it is the one that, as its journey carries it southward, becomes part of the boundary of Alabama and Georgia. In its pathway, the river has also been temporarily halted to make a reservoir or two that hold back the waters to be used by folks along the water for recreation and other water resources. But back up in the hills of North Georgia is where this story takes place. My two friends, Paul and Don, always looked forward to springtime. Yes, it meant that school would soon be over before long, and it also meant that the weather would become warmer, although sometimes a good bit wetter. It also meant that one of our favorite pastimes was drawing to a close. That would be the past year's hunting season. But now our thoughts turned to the season that was rapidly approaching, as it did with each new spring: trout fishing. Each spring, the Georgia Wildlife and Fishery Department would send many trucks with huge holding tanks on them to the many different rivers and streams that flowed through the mountains. In those holding tanks were hundreds and thousands and more thousands of trout that were to be released in the waterways to be caught by fishermen. Not that the streams did not have a trout population, but that with the coming of spring and the water temperature becoming just right, the number of people catching fish could really put a dent in the fish population numbers. And people aren't the only thing that enjoy fresh trout. Birds of many varieties, osprey, hawk, heron, egret, and one of the best fish catchers of all time, the kingfisher. But there's also coon, cat, weasel, otter, and even bear that enjoy a meal of fresh trout. But so do teenagers who, whenever they are given the opportunity, want to enjoy an evening meal of fresh trout that has been fried in hot grease with a coating of cornmeal and some potatoes and onions. Sometimes we would use a metal grate over a fire of hardwood coal and lay the clean trout, split lengthwise, on the grate and carefully tend it so it didn't burn or stick to the grate. This took a bit more effort and was really good if you got it right. Trout is a really delicate meat. If your fire was too hot or if you weren't watching and it flared up, then you might just have potatoes and onions for supper. But with patience and some careful tending, you could be enjoying a truly delicious meal. Most times we would get back to our campsite and get a fire going to cook fried trout and tell of our fishing adventures of the day. The stock trout were generally from 6 to 10 inches long and made up the biggest part of what we caught. But those pools and waterways also had some fish that had eluded the offered baits and lures of fishermen and had survived the elements, whether it be freezing temperatures or forest predators. Some grew into much larger fish, and there were also native fish, those that had not been stocked, that would reach much larger proportions, and because they had always had to fight the river's current, were much stronger fighters. How does one go about catching fish of that caliber and magnitude? Teenagers who save their pocket change and chore money just to be able to travel back and forth in the far reaches of solitude don't have the fancy fly rods and chest waders that we would often see when adults with steady incomes showed up in the same stretches of the river we were fishing. That was okay, because we knew that finicky trout have an appetite for a few things other than store-bought imitation bugs and lures. The creek salamander. Salamanders are a lizard-like amphibian that live the majority of their existence in the water. They can, like fish, breathe underwater and only come out to make little salamanders. But then they go back in whatever creek, stream, or river they crawled out of, and there's where trout find them. And they are high on a trout's menu. We knew how to catch this preferred bait. First, you ask your mom for some old nylon hosiery that she no longer wants. Cut off the foot about 8 to 10 inches long, and with an old wire coat hanger, fashion a loop and a handle. Then the hose can be affixed to that. Then, armed with this net, you slowly move along the shallow part of the waterway, hold the net on the stream bottom downstream of a rock, and lift the rock up with the net just below it. A salamander, thinking it has successfully eluded you, will dash out and into the waiting net because he thinks that will be another good hiding place. Lift your net and deposit him in your bait bucket. You now have one of the best trout baits there is. Our spinning rods had 6 to 8 pound test line and the smallest split shot weight you could buy with a small hook, usually number 10 or even 12. This allows the salamander to drift in the current as if it were trying to move from one place or another on the stream bottom and becomes an enticing offering to trout. The sudden tug on your line, followed by the rod dipping and dancing, proclaims your success. Certain places that have names given to them usually let you have memories about them for many a successful fishing trip. Eagle's Nest was where we almost always caught a limit. Otter's Point was beautiful water, but because of its namesake, fish were hard to come by. Bear Creek was where Paul had an encounter with a black bear that, to hear him tell the story, was the size of a school bus and had come close to having him for breakfast. Some fish also gained a reputation and even had names. Such a fish was Old Ephraim. We and several others we knew had the opportunity of offering up bait to Old Ephraim only to have lines stretched and snapped from the power of this wily old native rainbow. We had each caught some really nice trout up to about 3 pounds, but we never could do any more than guess the size of Old Ephraim because he was the monarch of his stretch of water. Deer Crossing was his habitat. On more than one occasion we stood in the flow of the river and watched deer moving almost as shadows, quickly and quietly across the stream. Then it fell off into some deeper, darker pools of cold water where lived Old Ephraim. We would float a hooked salamander into the upper stretch and quietly stand with a heart pounding in anticipation of a sudden jerk and tug. We did catch some other fish from Deer Crossing, but only on one occasion did a dream almost come true. I had 3 trout on my stringer attached to my belt and was feeling good about the day. Paul also had 3, so bragging rights were at stake for the evening meal. You had to be off the water at sunset, and we didn't want to chance a game warden coming along with us still fishing in the twilight. But the late hours when the sun is going down is an excellent time to catch fish. With about 15 or 20 minutes left before sunset, I had just carefully placed a hook through the bottom lip of a salamander and carefully flipped it into the flow of water that fed into the deepest part of Deer Crossing. While carefully letting line out with just enough tension to keep the critter from getting into the rocks on the bottom and hiding, I was momentarily distracted by something. My line went straight, tightened as I had hooked a truck bumper and almost took the rod from my hand. Reflex took over and I pulled straight up, setting the number 10 eagle claw hook into the jaw of old Ephraim. Paul was maybe 10 yards away and hollered, "You got old Ephraim!" I couldn't say anything. I knew I had to keep the tension on so that he would not be able to get to the rocks on the bottom and cut my line on the sharp edges that were his lair. Then, because he couldn't dive, he rose from the water. Leaping completely clear of the surface was a 7 or 8 pound dark rainbow trout that had seen many years in that watery domain. The line pulled to the left, cutting through the flowing stream, and just as quickly zipped back to the right. Then another leap, clearing the surface and defying me to apply more pressure to the already tight line. I would turn the handle of the reel and gain some of the line, lessening the distance between old Ephraim and my net. Then, because of the drag being set for the lighter line, his powerful tail would strip out more line than I had gained. "Keep the pressure on," I thought. Paul would echo my thoughts also. The sun crept slowly toward the horizon, and each time he leaped, the drops of water were like jewels over the river, or would they become tears? I felt like I had him defeated for just a minute, but it was not to be. The quietness that followed when my line suddenly parted was deafening. Paul had shouted advice and encouragement. I had done what I felt was the right way and technique to land the fish, but I guess it wasn't meant to be. We went back to Deer Crossing every chance we got. We caught some other trout there. We always had high hopes and anticipation, but I had a tale to tell. Old Ephraim still dwells in my memories of the northern Chattahoochee River. If I ever go back, or if you have the opportunity, I sure do hope to meet some of his relatives.